it would, or if the expansion continued, it would be at the sufferance of the South. You're absolutely right that slavery was at the heart of the issue. And here's where we have to distinguish. The question arises, what caused the Civil War? This is a question that's on any introductory history test. And was the Civil War caused by slavery, as supporters of Lincoln and the Union allege, or was it caused by, was it all about states' rights, as Southerners say? And the answer, if you ask me, is both. Because to get a civil war, two things had to happen. Two sides, two parties had to make decisions. Number one, the South had to decide to secede. Why did the South secede? The South seceded over slavery. Every one of the secession conventions, every bill, every statement of the reasons for secession points out that this cherished institution of the South, slavery, is at risk if we remain in a union presided over by this black Republican, Abraham Lincoln. So that's why the South seceded, over slavery. There's no denial of that. Even the hardcore defenders of the South can't deny it. All you have to do is look at the ordinances of secession. And slavery is front and center. However, what they also say is, it is our right to secede over whatever cause we want. If we simply don't like the color of Abraham Lincoln's beard, we can secede because states' rights take precedence over the federal union. This is the essence of states' rights. You have the right to secede. You don't have to ask permission of the federal government to secede. Now, they would argue we have the right to secede. Hey, the slavery issue wasn't the first time the South threatened to secede. And it wasn't just over slavery. In 1832, South Carolina threatened to secede over a tax bill, for heaven's sake. It was the tariff, the import tax of 1828. And South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification, saying that this measure will not be enforced in South Carolina. And when Andrew Jackson, the then president, indicated that he would enforce the measure against the opposition of South Carolina threatened to secede and said it is our right to secede. So the question of states' rights is conceptually separate from the question of slavery. If you believe in states' rights, then you believe in the right to secede. Now, why did the South secede in 1860? Ah, yes, it was over slavery. But the South had talked about seceding for 30 years beforehand. And here I just have to digress briefly because I talked about Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was president in 1832. And when Andrew Jackson was faced with the possibility of secession by South Carolina, he took exactly the opposite position of James Buchanan. James Buchanan was looking for reasons not to act. It was not in his personality to take forceful action. Leave aside the constitutional questions. But it just wasn't part of his temperament to take strong action. With Andrew Jackson, it was part of his temperament to take strong action. And Andrew Jackson told his Secretary of War to raise an army that he was going to lead into South Carolina, an army of 200,000 men. And when a South Carolina legislator came to the White House, he was about to leave Washington to head home for the Christmas holidays, when this crisis had reached a head. He stopped by the White House and he asked President Jackson, he said, "Mr. President, do you have a message for my constituents?" And Jackson looked at him and he said, "Yes, I do. Tell my friends in South Carolina." Jackson was a native South Carolinian. "Tell my friends in South Carolina that if one of them raises a finger to oppose the enforcement of federal law, I'm going to come down there and hang every one of them from the highest tree I can find." When Andrew Jackson talked about hanging people, South Carolina listened. As those of you who were here a couple of nights ago know, Andrew Jackson was the only president ever to have killed a man in cold blood. He was in a duel. When Andrew Jackson spoke strongly like that, he wasn't kidding around, and South Carolina backed down. I've often wondered, what would have happened if somebody like Andrew Jackson had been president in 1860? In fact, I'd go so far as to say, what would have happened?
Hey, George Washington, those Pennsylvanians weren't going to pay.
That's right.
And he raised an army.
You bet.
He inspected the troops.
Yep.
Before he sent
That's
them.
right. Okay. Now, what if Abraham Lincoln had been an Andrew Jackson? As much as I respect Abraham Lincoln and the difficulties he was in, one of the reasons the South seceded in 1860 and 1861, and one of the reasons, the principal reason the South Carolina didn't back down, was Jackson made clear, this means war and you guys are getting crushed. When the South seceded in 1860 and 1861, there were plenty of people in the South who didn't believe that the North would ever fight. And who didn't believe that if the North did fight, that the North would win. 30 years before, Jackson left no doubt on that subject. Between them, Buchanan and Lincoln left plenty of doubt on the subject. And so the South could leave in 1860 and 1861 thinking they're going to let us go. Okay, there was a third part of your question. Now I can't remember what the third part was.
I don't know which part you covered.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes.
I think you covered it all.
Okay, East versus West, slave. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. But the second half of the slavery question was, the South decides to secede. Why does it secede? Well, it's over slavery, but in defense of its states' rights. The second part of the Civil War comes, the North has to decide to oppose secession. Now, that raises the question, so what was Lincoln fighting for? What was Lincoln fighting for? What did Lincoln say he was fighting for? What did he want to be able to fight for? Lincoln was opposed to slavery. Lincoln rejected the institution of slavery as inhumane, undemocratic, and bad for the soul of America. But Lincoln read his Constitution. He read it quite frequently. He was a lawyer. He had debated Stephen Douglas. They had talked these questions up and down. And he knew perfectly well there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the President the authority to abolish slavery in the states where it existed. And he looked at his Constitution, and he couldn't find anything in there that even said Congress could abolish slavery in the states where it existed. So what's he going to do? Well, the most he can hope to do is to prevent the expansion of slavery into the federal territories, because the federal territories are under the direct control of Congress. Oh, but wait, Congress, not the President. So, the South decides to secede. Lincoln would love to be able to eradicate slavery, but he's got no legal or constitutional authority to do so. But he does have the authority to defend the Constitution. He has the responsibility to defend the Constitution. He swore that he would. And this Constitution that he swore on was the Constitution of the United States, not the Constitution of New York and Michigan and Minnesota and Massachusetts and the northern states one by one. It was the Constitution of the United States of America. And this gave him his authority to resist secession, because he didn't acknowledge secession. Lincoln never said that the South had seceded. The South was simply in rebellion. Southerners were simply refusing to obey federal laws. We're simply blocking the enforcement of federal laws. And just as Lyndon Johnson felt required to do in 1967 in Detroit, when riots convulsed Detroit, Johnson sent in federal troops. There was an insurrection. There was an inability of the state authorities to enforce the law in Detroit. So the federal government steps in. That was the authority on which Lincoln operated during the Civil War. But what did that mean for slavery? It was unclear during the first year of the war what that meant for slavery. And Lincoln went on record as saying slavery was secondary to his purposes. As he said, if I could hold the Union together by freeing all of the slaves, I would do so. If I could hold the Union together by freeing none of the slaves, I would do so. If I could hold the Union together by freeing some of the slaves and leaving half of them in chains, I would do that.